Uh, okay, David, nice to finally meet you.
Yes.
We had some troubles with the schedule, but finally we can. We are so glad to having you here with us and to meet you virtually. Um, I will do just a brief introduction in Spanish, and then we can start.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes. Sounds like someone was running over a little bit, so that's fine.
¿Puedo puchar el volumen de allí, por favor? Will you share your screen, PowerPoint or something?
Yeah.
Okay,
Did you
okay.
want me to share it now?
You can share it with us, and okay.
Does that look right?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Should I leave it up, or do you want me to stop sharing at the moment?
Anem ara a introduir l'última sessió de David Kirby, que ho farà en anglès. Espero que ho puguem seguir tots bé. El professor David Kirby és chair del Departament d'Estudis Interdisciplinars en Arts Liberals i el director del Science, Technology and Society Program en la Universitat, el Cal Poly, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry, en San Luis Obispo, en Califòrnia. Prèviament va ser professor de Science Communication Studies en el Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine de la Universitat de Manchester. La seva recerca examina com les pel·lícules, la televisió i els videojocs actuen com a vehicles de comunicació científica, tractant de comprendre com les històries que es conten sobre la ciència en els productes mediàtics influeixen en la construcció d'idees i en la nostra percepció de la ciència com a força social, cultural i política. Al seu llibre, Lab Coach in Hollywood Science, Scientists and Cinema, explorar la col·laboració entre científics i la indústria de l'entreteniment. Actualment està escrivint un llibre titulat Decent Science, Religion, Science and Movie Censorship, que explorarà com el cine va servir de camp de batalla sobre el paper de la ciència a l'hora d'influir en la moralitat. So, David, we're looking forward to listen your presentation, so you have the word. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, although I didn't understand a lot of it since my Spanish is very, very poor. But yeah, it's great to be talking here, in your group that's looking at sort of the scientific elements of horror. And I'm really happy to speak about the idea of scientists in fiction based on the work that I've done. And I'm going to mostly be focusing on scientists in cinema for my talk, since that's what my research has focused most on, is science in movies. So to start, one of the things we need to acknowledge is that, science and fiction, they represent two of the most powerful cultural institutions that humans have developed to understand and explore their world. Right? So the fusion of science and fiction has actually increased dramatically over the last 20 years in movies and TV and computer games. And one of the key components of science and fiction is the figure of the scientist. And this is really important in terms of science's relationship to society, right? Because what it shows is that science isn't some abstract or disembodied entity, right, that operates outside of society. Rather, what it shows, right, is that science is an activity that's conducted by humans. So the actions of scientists are what imbue the scientific institution with its agency, right, as a social, political, and cultural force. So it's not surprising that scientists are the most prominent and recognizable signifiers of scientific practice in our fictional products. So because scientists represent the public face of scientists, or because scientists represent the public face of science, depictions of scientists as characters can shape public perceptions, not just of real scientists, but of science itself. Now, as you probably know, the scientific community, they are consistently expressing their anxiety about representations of science in entertainment media, right? Because they believe that depictions of science and scientists are uniformly negative, right? Like the mad scientist character, right? Who's obsessively pursuing knowledge with an evil intent. And of course, it's true, as you probably talked about, that when most people hear the phrase movie scientist, they're probably thinking about this scene here that you see on the screen from the 1931 version of Frankenstein, right? Where Dr. Frankenstein is hysterically shouting, "It's alive, it's alive, it's alive." And historically, right, depictions of scientists in movies, they have often been very negative, right? In fact, it's not very difficult to find dozens of examples of stereotypical movie scientists, right? Including the ones known as the mad scientist or those that we would call the absent-minded professor. So I've got a sort of selection here, right? You got Rotwang up there in the corner. You've got a Bela Lugosi. You got a Boris Karloff, right? There's Doc Brown. So it's a smorgasbord of mad scientists, right? And these mad scientists, they often look the same, right? They are older white men. They've either got fuzzy Einstein hair or they're bald. They got big bushy beard, maybe, right? They got thick glasses. They're wearing a lab coat. Now, this might be the traditional stereotype of the scientist as seen in movies. But what we need to consider is that all of these movies were made before 1990, right? And most of them were made even before 1960. Now, if we look at academic research on the scientist character in movies and TV and computer games, if we look over the last 25 years, there's been a completely different picture of the scientist in fiction, right? There's been a really dramatic shift in the depictions of scientists in our entertainment media. So contemporary portrayals of scientists in movies or on TV or in computer games, they become far more complex than they previously were. And in fact, they become far more positive than previous stereotypes. Now, movie scientists in contemporary cinema, right, like the ones that are shown there on the left, have really gone from being the villain to now being the hero, right? Likewise, that sort of crazed Einstein-looking mad scientist, right? That's no longer the standard appearance for scientists in movies, as you can see here with these images. There's far more diversity within movie scientists, right? Far more female scientists and more scientists of color. So the traditional stereotypical scientist is essentially a relic of the past. I mean, you could still find them, right? The last refuge of the classical sort of stereotypical scientist, uh, it really seems to be sort of children's media, right? Where the simplicity of the narratives, it really increases the importance of conveying a character's occupation quickly, right? And without ambiguity. Or you could still find the absent-minded professor in comedies, right? Where pointing out sort of stereotypical differences, that's still one mode of humor. Or, as you've probably talked about, you can still occasionally find an old school mad scientist in horror films, where the motivations of the villains can sometimes be, fairly simplistic. Now, what contemporary studies show, however, is that, modern scientist characters are exhibiting a moral complexity that's not really found in previous portrayal of scientists as villains. So the morally ambiguous chemist Walter White, right, in the TV show Breaking Bad, I think, sort of best exemplifies this new style of non-traditional scientist villain. So it's circumstantial economic pressures, right, that motivated White's decision to utilize his science for criminal purposes, right? But it was his hubris, right? It was a character flaw that turned him into a scientific villain. And mad scientists in contemporary cinema, right, they're generally not actually, quote unquote, mad, right? They're not irrational actors. Instead, their moral lapses are due to sort of an excess of rationality, right? And their villainy is most often rooted in a sort of misguided desire, right, to improve society. For example, the environment has become a very common theme for scientific villains. So you can see up top, there's Samuel L. Jackson playing the villain in the movie Kingsman. And his motivation by trying to destroy a lot of the world is to save the environment. Another example of the contemporary mad scientist comes from the film They Cloned Tyrone, which you see there on the bottom right. That scientific villain aims to solve racism by cloning young Black men. And his goal, right, it's not to rule the world, it's not to destroy humanity. He wants to solve the problem of violence and poverty in the American Black community. But rather than, seeing these issues as the result of systemic racism, he sees it as Black people not being white enough, right? So he's trying to use his genetic science to essentially force assimilation by turning Black people into white people, right? So much more complicated version of the mad scientist in contemporary fiction. Okay, so you might be asking yourselves, right? So these scientific depictions, they've changed really dramatically uh, over the last 20, 25 years. So how did we get here, right? Why are there more positive depictions of scientists in movies and in media overall? Well, the easiest answer to that is that media producers started incorporating more positive depictions of science for sort of purely commercial reasons, right? So you see there Jurassic Park, right? You have real big box office takes for films like Jurassic Park or Twister in the 1990s. And you also have really massive TV ratings for TV shows like CSI and House in the early 2000s, right? So what that showed is that, there was a substantial audience for science-based entertainment products. And successes with the Academy Awards and Emmy Awards also convinced entertainment producers that positive depictions of science can actually add prestige to an entertainment product. But I single out, one of the primary reasons that entertainment producers have gravitated towards science and towards positive depictions of science is that contemporary entertainment, it now emphasizes realism, right, across media and across genres. And this emphasis on realism in entertainment, it can be attributed to a number of different factors, including, and I've got a picture here from the non-science product, Lord of the Rings. So you had a lot of gritty realism in the Lord of the Rings films. And you can see that in Aragorn here, right? His hands are dirty. He's got a ripped sleeve. It's not a sort of, prettified version, right? As well, Christopher Nolan's Batman films also had that sort of gritty realism associated with it. And you also had a lot of realist orientations in critically lauded quality television dramas like Game of Thrones. Right. So that growing desire for realism led filmmakers and TV producers to increasingly look to science to help them ground their texts in a realist framework. Right. And this is because historically, there's been a long-standing relationship between science and conceptions of realism. science has been the Western world's accepted mode of determining, quote unquote, truth since the Age of Enlightenment. Or there's a quote from the historian of science, Stephen Shapin, that I really like, where he says, "Science is modernity's reality-defining enterprise." So this relationship between science and realism, right, it's led to an increase in the number of scientists that are brought on board to act as consultants for movies and television productions, right? In fact, it would actually be very surprising today to have an American film or TV show that contains substantial scientific content that didn't involve a science consultant. And there are some high-profile scientific organizations, most prominently the U.S. National Academy of Sciences has what's called the Science and Entertainment Exchange, that have developed these initiatives that connect entertainment professionals with scientists. And the success of these initiatives, it's a major reason why popular images of scientists have changed so dramatically over the last 20 years, right? Because it's much more difficult for filmmakers to stick with old, worn out, negative stereotypes like the mad scientist when they're actually asking real life scientists for assistance with their movies or TV show. So the images that you see there on the screen, these are all examples of scientists working with actors, to sort of help them, quote unquote, act like a scientist. And so for my book, Lab Coats in Hollywood, I spoke with a large number of scientists about their experiences working as consultants for movies, including their experiences working with actors. And for many of these consultants, the bulk of their participation was actually working with actors to try and help the actors act like a scientist. And that influx of science consultants has certainly reduced the number of overt scientist stereotypes in movies. And some of this is also because they look over scripts. So for example, I talked to scientists who worked on the movie Deep Impact. And the original script for Deep Impact had an astronomer character who worked at an observatory in Arizona. And this character ran around naked in the observatory all the time. Now, when the science consultants saw that scene in the script, right, they were able to get the scriptwriter to rewrite that character, or actually they removed him entirely, right? Especially when they asked him if he knew how cold it got at night in the desert. No one would be running around naked, right? It was meant to show the scientist as eccentric, but they were able to argue that's not what real scientists would do. But while they're able to remove those types of scientists, right, that stereotype, removing stereotypes is not really the same thing as portraying a quote unquote real scientist. So this is the question that I'm going to dig into for the rest of my time, right? What does it mean to quote unquote act like a scientist? Now, one thing that scientists help actors with is to replicate scientific actions, right? Like the ones scientists do in their labs. But it's not actually as easy or trivial as it sounds to do scientific actions. Right? There are a lot of actions that scientists do every day of their lives. And that then becomes natural to them. So it's very difficult for actors to learn and replicate those movements very quickly. So as an example, a personal example, right there, that's me in my former life, which you can see was a long time ago because I had a lot more hair in that picture. So you can see I'm trained as a scientist. What I'm using there is a piece of equipment called a pipette, and I used a pipette every day for 6 years. Right, so it became natural to me. But when you give a pipette to an actor, they have no idea what to do with it, right? They often think it's like a gun that you sort of point it at people. And in fact, if we look at Sigourney Weaver here in the movie Avatar, she actually does a cardinal sin with a pipette. Notice how she turns it upside down, right? That is the cardinal sin you never do with a pipette. So getting actors to do scientific actions is very difficult. And that's why when you have a science consultant on your film, they actually frequently tell filmmakers to use their postdocs and their PhD students if they need background characters doing some sort of scientific actions in a film. So the films you see there on the screen, all those people are actually real scientists. They're doing real scientific actions because that was just easier to have those scientists who've been doing these things all their lives just do them as if they're doing them rather than training an extra to try and look natural doing those actions. Now, one element of acting like a scientist that most people don't actually think about is the fact that writing out mathematical equations by hand, right? That's a skill that scientists develop over years and years. And it's actually very difficult for actors to pick up that skill quickly. And they don't look natural when they're writing out equations themselves. So in many cases that I looked at, the filmmakers had to rely on film techniques to make it seem as if these actors were mathematically inclined. So in one case that you see there on the left, they actually had their science consultant, who was a mathematician from Columbia University called Dave Baer, write out all the equations that supposedly Russell Crowe's character was writing out. Right? So they always had close-ups of Dave Baer, the science consultant's hand, writing all those scientific equations. But what that actually meant is that he had to really serve as what they called a hand double for any scene that had short close-ups of the character's hands, right? So he often was shown in other scenes, non-mathematical. Along those same lines, the filmmakers of the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still, right? They not only needed equations on the chalkboard to look authentic, but they needed actor Keanu Reeves to look like he was actually writing out these equations himself. So to achieve this, the art director had an astronomer from the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, a guy named Seth Shostak. They had him write the equations on the blackboard in pencil so that Reeves could then write over those equations in chalk during the filming to make it look like he was writing them out. And then the filmmakers later used some editing tricks, right, to make it look like Reeves was writing faster than he was. And for me, these examples are something that made the book, really fun to write. So for one thing, right, they show that being a scientist is more than just knowing a bunch of scientific facts. But these examples also relieve, what's fascinating about movie magic, right? That by using sort of standard movie techniques, the filmmakers can turn anyone, right, even Keanu Reeves, into a scientific genius. Now, another element that's unique to scientist behavior is the use of scientific jargon. Every consultant I spoke with helped the scriptwriters to develop technical dialogue. And for many of the actors, scientific jargon was like a foreign language, right? They considered it gobbledygook or technobabble. So on Deep Impact, that you see there on the left, one of the science consultants, they told the actors that the phrase astronomers use for when a liquid on a comet undergoes sublimation, right, goes straight from liquid to gas, right, they call that outgassing. But of course, the actors didn't actually believe him. They thought he was playing a joke on them. In fact, he says he received a phone call on the day they were shooting a scene with the sublimation because the actor working with him still didn't believe that this was a legitimate scientific term, right? Because to them, it sounded kind of dirty, right? Outgassing. And this anecdote is really telling, right? Because it clearly shows how actors and filmmakers, they have to take it on faith, right? That science consultants are providing them with the appropriate technical terms. So if all scientific jargon sounds like gobbledygook, right, how would an actor know if outgassing was a made-up word or a real scientific term? And in addition to providing the scientific words for the actors to use, the science consultants, they also have to help the actors pronounce the scientific jargon, right? And many of those words, they're not really easy to say, right? Gamma globulin or electrophoresis, right? Or the dinosaur that you see on the right, that is Pachycephalosaurus, right? Those words, they don't just trip off the tongue. And that raises an important point about the power of scientific language in portraying a scientist on the screen, right? The authority that's inherent to scientific jargon, it doesn't come from the words themselves. It comes from the suggestion that the person saying the words actually knows what the words mean. So an actor who's struggling with a scientific phrase is not going to convince anyone that the character knows the word's meaning. But an actor who can pronounce the appropriate words, right, that gives their character power within the fictional world. It means that this character has knowledge that other characters don't have. Okay, scientific actions, scientific jargon, really important. But it's not totally what scientists need to really act like a scientist, right? Actors, they're really looking for something that will help them convey to the audience, right? This character is a scientist, right? They're not a stockbroker, they're not a lumberjack. But that gets us back to the concern that scientists have about their portrayal in movies and TV shows, right? That actors are relying on stereotypes by making it seem like scientists are somehow really different from other people. Now, I'm sure everyone here knows a scientist, right? You know, as people, they're not much different from anyone else. Right? They have the same daily concerns as everybody, right? Family, bills, housework, who's walking the dog. But the perception that scientists are different from the rest of society really runs deep. So on the recent film Twisters, that you see there on the left, Glenn Powell spent a week shadowing a scientist named Sean Hua. He's a meteorologist. According to Hua, Powell intently watched everything he did, right? Looking for something that would give him an insight into how scientists behave. And Hua tells one story about, he was driving with Powell, and that Powell kept telling his assistant to write down how Hua was driving his car, right? See how he took that turn, write that down, right? It was as if the essence of being a scientist, right, could somehow be gleaned in everyday behaviors, because the actor figured that surely a scientist drove a car differently than everybody else. Now, we also interviewed a paleontologist from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., who works on duck-billed dinosaurs, right? These are iguanodons. And he's the world's leading expert on duck-billed dinosaurs. And he was brought in very early on the pre-production process for Jurassic Park. And he said that the filmmakers spent 2 hours asking him questions. He expected these questions would be about duck-billed dinosaurs, right? He's the world's leading expert on this topic. But they didn't ask him any questions about iguanodons. Instead, they kept asking him how a paleontologist would respond or act in various situations. So if you dug this thing up, what would you think? Or they asked him, how would a paleontologist react if he walked around a corner and saw a Tyrannosaurus Rex? Now, his answer to them was, well, he'd react like everybody else, right? He would drop a load in his trousers and he would faint. But the expectation, of course, is that scientists have to be somehow different, right? And while scientists are the same as other people in many, many respects, right? They're just human beings. They are different in one key respect. They are motivated to do science. And the actors want to know why that is. So the scientist Brian Cox from my previous university, University of Manchester, he worked on a film called Sunshine. And his job was to help the actors understand what would motivate a scientist to go on a suicidal mission to the sun. Now, the filmmakers themselves, many of them, would have been motivated by a sense of religious belief. But Brian He's representative of the scientific community. He wasn't motivated by religion. So what would motivate him? Now, among the many things that Cox told them is that he would be motivated to undertake this mission to the sun because he understands that nature is more beautiful and complex than anyone can imagine. And that the joy of doing science is to experience the unknown and then to find the answers to that uncertainty. But at the end of the day, right, the scientist can only do so much in conveying what it means to be a scientist. It's then up to the actors to use their own skills to convey their impressions of what it means to be a scientist down to the audience. So ultimately, actors and directors, they're tapping into a scientist experience in being a scientist. And in that respect, scientists are no different from other occupational consultants working on popular films, right? Like military consultants or police advisors or political consultants. Right? All those consultants know through experience the actions, the psychological motivations, the movements, the behaviors, the lingo, right? The interpersonal interactions that are needed to convey their occupation. But the thing that separates science from these other professions is that scientists' actions and their behaviors, it's in the service of a knowledge-producing activity. So in the end, authenticity doesn't come from looking like you can hold a pipette properly. It comes from the fact that your actions lead to knowledge production. And I will end there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It was pretty interesting. I don't know if anyone here have a question. ¿Vol preguntar alguna cosa? O... Sí, sí. Sí, millor veniu així tu. Okay.
Thanks, David, for your talk. That's very interesting. And I wanted to ask you, in relation to science consultants, you were always referring to scientists acting as science consultants. I don't know if there's some, you know of some case in which STS scholars, historians of science have intervened in this as science consultants or as consultants there. Because I was thinking that maybe you were focusing on if they were capable of using the pipette, for instance, correctly, this kind of task. Obviously, it's maybe the scientist who has to inform or whatever. But then there are many kind of biases that we see in how science is represented or thought of in the population, no? And maybe there are STS historians could give an image either to correct what we think are not correct images of science, or to connect with these even if not correct images. No, so I don't know if this kind of experience has if you know of this kind of experience and how you think it can contribute to films.
Yeah, great question. Yes, there actually have been STS scholars and historians of science who've worked on films and especially TV shows. So the recent film Oppenheimer had some historians of science working on it. But the TV shows Chernobyl, and I'm trying to remember some of the other ones. They also had some historians of science working with them on that. Yeah, I left it a little bit out because it complicates it a little bit, is that, scientists, they're creating knowledge, but the other type of consultant that creates knowledge, historians. So historical consultants, it's the same thing, right? It's about our knowledge that we've created. So yeah, they've worked on those and they have, brought their perspectives to it, right? So often scientists will want to, one of the reasons why we get more positive rather than realistic depictions of scientists currently is, scientists are working on this, working with the actors, they want to make them look positive. Whereas the historian, they say, okay, it's not always positive, right? They're not giving a sort of glossy version of what science is, what science does. And you can see that in terms of the types of products that they were making, right? Like Oppenheimer, right? Where Oppenheimer is clearly a very, you know, mixed character, right? He's not, you know, some scientist who's done amazing thing, right? He's not invented some amazing thing. It's really complicated. And so the historians of science who worked with them, you were able to sort of get that across. Or Chernobyl, where you ran into the same thing. And there was a TV show about same thing, development of the Manhattan Project, where historians of science worked on it. And it was, you know, it wasn't a glorification of it. It was really questioning of what they were doing.
Any question more? Or... Kırıkın. So, okay, thank you very much, David. It was pretty interesting. It was very appropriate for our day because we had been traveling through the times all the day since this morning here, because now it's 8 a.m. I think in California, more or less.
Yeah.
So 9, but we are here from the 10 since 10 here in Spain, and we were talking about different movies, and it's very interesting to see what happened, especially after after the 90s, because we didn't pass the 90s this morning, and I was thinking about how before this change and all the movies we talk about, it was more important to look scientific, how they want to communicate to the people, the idea that to play with the imaginary, to play with the stereotypes in a very crazy way sometimes, and not about being realistic. So it's very interesting for closing our day. So thank you very much, and nice to meet you.
Yeah. No problem. Is yeah, it's probably time for everyone to go grab a drink after a long day.
Yeah. That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's
Good. Well,
you cannot be here to have a drink with us, but
yeah.
maybe next time. Who knows?
Yeah.
So,
Well, thanks for having me. Happy to talk about this with everyone.
okay. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Doncs tornem al valencià. No sé si algú volia fer alguna pregunta abans a Andrés, perquè he vist que ha tornat. No sé si algú té alguna recàmera i ja acabem. Sí. No sé si algú vol...
Sí, si van importar assessors i articles. Si jo sàpiga, no. La veritat és que no he llegit encara, me les compraré, perquè després de veure la pel·lícula un parell de vegades més, m'he quedat en molta intriga. No, podràs treballar en 30 anys, és una cosa increïble. I és ràpida, no n'hi ha en la biografia canònica una experiència de psicosi de primera persona o de segona persona, en el sentit que tinguera una mare, un pare, que fora un psicòleg. És l'únic que me donaria un xic. No, és de suposar que alguna assessoria li hauria. És de suposar. Però en assessoria i tot és pràcticament el gran mèrit que té la pel·lícula és la manera de mostrar el que és el desenvolupament de la psicosi sense formular res explícitament. esta sensació de, literalment, d'alienació, no? Que és l'alienació de la protagonista, és el que transmiteix modernament, i és la filla ja tenim. El llibre de Conrad, el de l'Economia Viviente, va eixir l'any 58. A mi em sembla molt improbable que va ser el 65 aquell municipi de l'Economia Viviente. Perquè va eixir en alemany, en els instituts, perquè parlava de tomato, però encara que estigués en la edició anglesa, no ho sé, em sembla molt difícil, perquè són textos